Yesterday, the Secretary of State for exiting the EU defended the government's right to proceed without Parliament's micromanagement. Let's take a look at some of the exchanges.
The referendum was backed by 6 to 1 in this House, and on all sides of the argument, Leave and Remain, we have a duty to respect and carry out the people's instruction. Now, as I said, the mandate is clear, and we will reject any attempt to undo the referendum result, any attempt to hold up the process unduly, or any attempt to keep Britain in the EU by the back door by those who didn't like the answer they were given on June 23rd.
During the referendum campaign, much was made of the Leave side about parliamentary sovereignty. In his statement, the Secretary of State says, "We will return sovereignty to the institutions of this United Kingdom." Yet it seems that the government wants to draw up negotiating terms, negotiate and reach a deal without any parliamentary approval. That is not making Parliament sovereign. That is sidelining Parliament.
Can I point out to him that if he is to advise his opposite number, he might remind him that the repeal of the 72 European Communities Act will give many, many opportunities to amend and debate every single aspect of the discussions around the invoking of Article 50. And just in case they hadn't noticed, they also have the device of opposition days when they can debate absolutely anything they choose, even the whole issue of the European Union. So may I urge him to get on with the process and don't listen to those who really want to bog it down and never let it happen.
Now, 3 days before he was appointed, the Secretary of State published an article saying it was very important to publish a pre-negotiation white paper. Exactly. Can he tell us when is he going to publish that white paper?
Absolutely.
And as someone who for many years railed about the importance of the powers of backbenchers and Parliament against the executive, can he give us now with a straight face an answer to the question, where is the government's mandate for its negotiations, either from this House or the country?
Clarke.
I've been a great admirer of the Secretary of State for his staunch defence of civil liberties, his staunch defence of the prerogatives of this House. I was a great admirer when he moved the bill on parliamentary control of the executive in 1999, where he stirringly told us that executive decisions by the government should be subject to the scrutiny and approval of Parliament. So could he tell us, on the basis of what constitutional principle does he believe that the Prime Minister can now arrogate to herself the exclusive right to interpret what Brexit means, impose it upon the country, rather than protect the rightful role of scrutiny and approval of this House?
Mr. Michael Gove. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend will be aware that sometimes it is very important to pay attention to the Liberal elite. And he will be aware that on referendum night, we were told, "I will forgive no one who does not respect the sovereign voice of the British people once it has spoken, whether it is a majority of 1% or 20%. When the British people have spoken, you do what they command. Either you believe in democracy or you do not." Those were the words of Lord Ashdown of Norton-sub-Hamden in the district of Yeovil in the county of Somerset, who's the most elitist Liberal I know. And that's saying something. Can I therefore urge my right honourable friend to be true to the views of Lord Ashdown, to the principles of liberalism and the traditions of this House, and give effect to the British people's vote? 17 million votes were cast on June the 23rd for Britain to leave the European Union, and attempts by anti-democratic and illiberal voices on the opposition benches to thwart the British people's will rightly be treated with disdain.
Michael Gove ending that report there. Well, we're joined now by the Conservative MP Rees Mogg, who campaigned for the UK to leave the EU. Welcome to the programme.
Thank you.
Ken Clarke, will you support the call from Labour and Liberal Democrats for a vote on the government's initial negotiating position?
Yes, I will, because the problem with the referendum was nobody voted for anything. No two Brexiteers were entirely agreed with each other on exactly what you would do in the event of them winning it. And we're now deeply immersed, because it's the most urgent problem, in trade arrangements with Europe and a lot of other countries in the rest of the world, which weren't the subject matter of the referendum in the faintest detail. And that reinforces, I think, the overriding constitutional position. We have a parliamentary democracy, and government is made better when it's accountable for the details of what it does to a representative parliament.
Let's put that to Jacob Rees Mogg, particularly the opening remark there, that no two Brexiteers had the same vision. So there has to be a vote on that initial negotiating stance.
Well, I think this is wrong, and it's fascinating that none of the pro-Remainers asked for a debate on David Cameron's negotiating terms before he did his renegotiation. That was deemed to be a perfectly normal exercise by the government of its powers. It is unknown to have this type of vote on what a government may negotiate. Parliament scrutinises what has been done.
But is it
rather than authorise.
It may be unknown, but is it wrong to have some sort of vote by Parliament, bearing in mind sovereignty was such a cornerstone of your whole campaign? Why deny Parliament that sovereignty?
Parliament's not denied any vote or debate at all. It's having a vote tomorrow on an Opposition Day motion. It's had two statements.
But that's not binding, is it, in any way?
Well, the only binding votes that Parliament has are legislation. And legislation comes at the end of the process, not at the beginning. Our Constitution is very straightforward. It has a separation of powers between the executive, the legislature and the judiciary, and this is well known and well established. The executive makes the day-to-day decisions about running the country. They then require legislative approval, for which they have to go to Parliament, and Parliament provides redress of grievance. There is as yet no grievance because there's no decision.
And your concern and your call for a vote at this opening stage is just going to fuel the argument that you just want to thwart the referendum result.
Well, that's a way of getting out of debating what it is we're going for. I mean, the government doesn't know what it's going for at the moment, although it effectively announced at the conference that we're leaving the single market and we're leaving the customs union, which is the very reverse to what was argued in the referendum, because everybody was in favour of free trade and maintaining all our trading links then.
Was it the reverse?
But Parliament, just on what Jacob just said, the idea that you could interpret the parliamentary sovereignty in our constitution, which Jacob and I are both ardent supporters of. Parliament never discusses policy. Parliament can't vote on policy. Parliament can only wait to see whatever the government wants to do and allow it to happen, and only then can it vote when the government has committed the country to all the decisions. That is a startling diminution of the role of Parliament, even in the face of a referendum.
All right, well, we'll come back on the Parliament. Just before I come back to you, Jacob Rees Mogg, when you say that actually the vote to leave didn't automatically mean leaving the single market, what does it mean then to leave the EU if it isn't to leave the single market?
Well, on both sides, different voters had different ideas, and a lot of the vote is being interpreted as we want fewer foreigners. We don't like foreigners, was one of the Leave things. But of course there were many intelligent, perfectly civilised people on the Leave side who had different arguments. One thing all the Leave people agreed on was the virtues of free trade. I mean, for 40 years I've been in a party divided over Europe, but the one thing we all agree on is how marvellous free trade is. Liam Fox still makes the case.
But you can have free trade out of the single market.
Now we're going protectionist and withdrawing from the market.
Let me get Jacob Rees Mogg to respond.
That's wrong. The single market is not free trade. It is protectionism on a European scale. Outside the single market, outside the customs union, we can have genuine free trade. And people voted to leave the European Union. The single market and the customs union are the mainstay of the European Union. If we remain in those, we have not left the European Union.
Do you accept that?
We've ruled out staying in.
Right, but
the key thing, for the benefit of our children and grandchildren, is to, if we possibly can, stay in the single market and the customs union, and Jacob agrees with me.
Right, no, but hang on a second. I think Jacob Rees Mogg is saying that the single market is an intrinsic part of being in the EU. If you leave the EU, you do leave the single market.
The single market is the biggest free trade area in the world. 500 million population.
There may be a lot of people.
It is a free trade area. It's just that you don't want to be part of it.
It's a regulated area. The thing about the single market is that it brings in EU regulation, the EU courts and EU law. If we remain in the single market, we remain in the European Union. We have to leave it. And we also have, crucially, customs barriers against the rest of the world,
Sure.
which in some cases are very high.
Do you-
So it's not free trade if we remain in the single market.
Do you accept, though, that it wasn't explicit in the Vote Leave campaign, that actually it was left vague enough that somehow there was a reluctance to state very clearly at that point that voting to leave the EU would automatically, in the minds of the Vote Leave campaign, mean leaving the single market?
I think that was obvious. That the
It was
point
never
of the-
stated, though, clearly,
but the
was
point-
it?
Well,
Might have been obvious to you.
Hold on,
but many
within the
Brit-
campaign, it was stated very clearly that once we left, we would need to negotiate a free trade agreement with the European Union. There would have been no need to do that if we remained in the single market. And the vote was about leaving the European Union. And yet the single market is the heart, the beating heart of the European Union. If we were still part of that, our blood circulation would be caused by the European Union. Continue
Right.
with my medical analogy.
I mean, you do accept that leaving the EU meant not being part of the European Parliament, not being part of the European Commission, not being part of those key EU institutions, including the single market.
Yes, but different Brexiteers argued different things during the referendum, but the majority of them argued that leaving the European Union need have no effect on our economic relationships. When people said this is our biggest single market, it's the only set of countries with whom we have negotiated completely free entry for most of our goods and quite a lot of our services. We previously were trying to get more. When we argue, but it's very important to our future economics position, Brexiteers said, "Oh, that's all right. That they'll give us that because we're so important to them. We'll carry on as before."
And
first thing we're doing now is withdrawing from
right,
it all.
and on that basis, if you say it was obvious to everybody who voted leave that Britain would then leave the single market because, as you say, it's the beating heart of the EU, does that mean the government has a mandate to take us out of anything that has EU fingerprints on it?
We have a mandate to leave the European Union.
Sure. So the
means,
European
obviously,
Aviation Safety Agency?
We don't have to be part of any, we cannot remain part of any European body that is exclusively members of the European Union and has the European Court of Justice as its ultimate arbiter. But on the point of the single market, the EU is in the midst of negotiations with the United States and with Canada to increase access to its market by those countries.
Hasn't been ratified, of course, the Canadian Service, and it's taken a very long time.
That's absolutely true, but it would have been absolutely bizarre, and would be bizarre of the European Union, to put up trade barriers against a country that on the day we leave meets all its regulatory requirements. If they wish to do that, they will harm their own economy. They may choose to damage their own economy, but it would be an eccentric thing for them to do.
What do you say to this issue, that actually there would be this element of self-harm by the EU to punish Britain, if you like, for leaving the EU and then trying to negotiate some sort of trade deal, which Boris Johnson said we can have our cake and eat it, which for many people meant staying part of the single market and having all the benefits
Boris
and
was
so on.
the mainstream campaigner
what
talking nonsense.
Is that a lever? I mean, is Jacob Rees-Mogg right that they won't actually harm themselves or risk tariffs being put on goods that they would like to import from Britain in these negotiations?
Well, there will be some harm to the continental economy, that is right. But the things we're asking of them are things they can't possibly concede without every other country they have any trade relationship with, and some of the weaker member states demanding exactly the same. And once you say we're going to stop free movement of labour, your nationals are going to require work visas if they come in our bit of the single market. Once we say we're not going to obey the rules of the market, we're going to make them all British at first, but then when we can think of one we want to repeal, and at the moment the Brexiteers can't, we're going to change one. We're going to look for some that we want to change to make them British. And we're not going to accept the European Court, because the European Court, the reason the EU works is the European Court enforces the treaty obligations on 28 governments who wouldn't otherwise agree. The last big case we had there was a triumph for us because we defeated attempts to exclude us from Eurozone financial markets.
Yes, go on.
Just want to say one thing. I think Mr. Clarke in that answer has shown why remaining in the single market means remaining in the European Union. He doesn't want to leave the European Union. He regrets the vote. And staying under the auspices of the European Court of Justice in any way means we have not left the European
case has
Union.
upset you?
Because,
which case have we lost that upsets you?
It is superior law.
No, which so is the International Court in The Hague.
No, it's not.
Are we pulling out of all these?
The court in The Hague applies law which we then have to apply via Parliament, whereas ECJ law, as you know, is our law automatically and doesn't require any approval of Parliament. It overrules British statutes.
Give our viewers some examples of laws that you have been very unhappy about, or laws that you would repeal immediately.
Things that affect my farmers, the three-crop rule, for example, the ban on neonicotinoids, for example, have been damaging at agriculture on cases that we lost. All those years ago, the 48-hour working week, which was brought in under health and safety, when we had an opt-out under the social chapter, which the government, you remember, of negotiated. That's the point of it, that the European Court has been a politicising court pushing the ever closer union of the European Union.
Are these, Ken Clarke, key decisions that people would be worried?
There are two big ones. One we did lose, that I was around when it happened. We went there contrary to our own legal advice, arguing that the Working Time Directive, the 48-hour rule, was not a health regulation. Well, the reason even Victorians restricted hours of work was for health, so we lost that. Now, Theresa's made it quite clear, one thing we're not going to do is start tightening up on labour regulations, so we're not going to take advantage of leaving so that people are obliged to work more than 48 hours if they don't want to.
A law that you would repeal, the minute we have subsumed all of that European law into British law, and then you decide to keep it, which ones would you get rid of?
Oh, well, I would get rid of the three-crop rule straight away.
OK, fine.
But there are hundreds of rules to get rid of.
Right, you say that, but which is a key one that will...
You cited banned chemicals and pesticides.
Well, I was talking about agriculture, which I represent a rural constituency.
Well, that's why you're saying it. Have a go at Friends of the Earth and
But it would give us freedom to set our own fishing quotas that would benefit our fishermen. We would be able to have light bulbs in our homes that work so people can see in the dark. There are all sorts of useful
people
things
might argue that it's useful, but it's not absolutely intrinsic to life.
We could stop having all these German cars that are poisoning us by chucking out diesel and fiddling the figures.
All right,
there are endless things we can do.
Let's move on to Treasury figures out today, because there's been a pretty dramatic fall in the value of sterling. We already had a forecast, albeit through the campaign, to say there would be a 4% hit to GDP from Brexit and a dramatic drop in tax revenues. And today, on the front page of the Times newspaper, leaked Treasury papers say that Brexit could cost £66 billion a year. Now, are these all scare stories, Jacob Rees Mogg, or are they the bumps in the road that Theresa May is talking about?
The leaked Treasury paper is not a leaked paper. It's that very bad paper it put together, basically dishonest paper it put together during the Brexit campaign, where it said that if we left the European Union and then imposed tariffs on everybody who sells to us, we would have a bad economic time. It's a completely stupid paper, and the Treasury is undermining the government's own negotiating position, and it's really serious that the Treasury is behaving like this.
Or is there any truth? Or
as though it's abuse of its position.
Right. Well,
it's a bogus report.
I accept that, your point that there should be inquiry, but just looking at the economic figures,
let's look at sterling.
On sterling, and reports that there could be a 5 pence a litre put on petrol by the end of the week. Are those the bumps in the road?
Well, the oil price has gone up, so that often has an effect on. Well, devaluation, the last two big devaluations in this country, in 1992, just before you took over as Chancellor of the Exchequer, and in 1931, when we went off the gold standard, led to enormous increases in the prosperity of the country.
So this has nothing to do with Brexit?
Oh, no, Brexit has brought forward the devaluation of the pound, which was considered by both the IMF and the OECD to be overvalued in the first place.
Right, and what about that? I mean, even Mervyn King is saying it's a welcome thing.
We'll leave aside the fact we're going to join the WTO with no tariffs and all that. That's getting too technical, I agree. That was all settled by the referendum, apparently.
A welcome change to this devaluation that was needed and will help exports.
Since 2006, when we had the financial crash, we have devalued by 40%. We now have the worst current account deficit, usually most people would call it the balance of payments, that we've had in our history. The Eurosceptic argument that junking your own currency is somehow a marvellous advantage, which they've peddled for years, is, I fear, an illusion, an absolute illusion. The markets did collapse. I agree, given the state of affairs we have, it was probably slightly undervalued, but they collapsed because their judgment was the long-term outlook for the British economy was bad. I mean, we're no longer the 5th biggest economy in the world, we're the 6th now.
All right,
as a result already, and we're going to go further if we're not careful.
Just very, very briefly, and finally, Jacob Rees Mogg, if being poorer as a nation for a short period of time, you may not believe we're going to be poorer as a nation at all. But if it is the price to pay for what you see as controlling borders and a return of sovereignty, is that worth it?
We're going to be richer because we're going to be outside the dead-handed control of the European Union. We can set our own tariffs. We can have cheaper goods coming in. There's a ridiculous report from some lobby group yesterday saying the price of food will go up. It'll go down because we can reduce tariffs against the rest of the world, which in the EU we can't do. So all this scaremongering we should put to one side and look beautifully, as we do, at the picture behind you of broad sunlit uplands.
Jacob Rees Mogg. With that, thank you.